It's truly a privilege, and I need to admit a challenge to introduce today's speaker. Professor Michèle Lamont is a cultural and comparative sociologist. I think that one of the leading scholars in the field, with a fascinating intellectual trajectory and a truly remarkable list of publications and professional achievements. Currently, Professor Lamont is a professor of sociology and African American Studies, and Robert I. Goldman Professor of European Studies at Harvard University. She served as president of the American Sociological Association in 2016-2017. She is an elected member of, among others, the American Academy of Arts and Science, the Royal Society of Canada, and the British Academy. She has received numerous fellowships, such as the Guggenheim Fellowship and the Carnegie Fellowship. And most recently, she was the recipient of the 2024 Colley Prize for Sociology. As a cultural sociologist, Professor Lamont studies inclusion and inequality, the construction of symbolic and social boundaries, the production and evaluation of knowledge. She conducts research and writes on such timely and pressing topics as dignity, stigma, racism, class cultures, and social change. She is the author of several books and collective works and over 100 articles published in some of the most prominent outlets in social science, including American Sociological Review, Theory, Culture and Society, and American Journal of Sociology. She is the author of several award-winning books. I mean, I should have a huge pile next to me, including Money, Morals and Manners, The Culture of the French and the American Upper Middle Class, The Dignity of Working Men, Morality and the Boundaries of Race, Class and Immigration. One of my favorites, How Professors Think. I still try to understand how professors think inside the curious world of academic judgment, and the co-authored Getting Respect, Responding to Stigma and Discrimination in the United States, Brazil, and Israel. Her most recent book, and I think we are going to hear about it tonight, is Seeing Others, How Recognition Works and How It Can Heal a Divided World. I think that tonight we are also going to hear about Professor Lamont's new project, Recognition Globally, which analyzes recognition claims in a variety of settings in the US, UK, and Canada to help us better understand how to move toward a more inclusive society. Professor Lamont, welcome to the EUI and welcome to the Max Weber program. Professors.
I'm doubly thrilled that you introduced me, since I discovered that Carolina's been a student of mine, Virag Molnar, who teaches at the New School. So it's a real pleasure to meet you, and it's a pleasure to be here. I haven't been here in a few years, and for me, EUI was always this unbelievable place, and not the Dolce Vita that Italy is known for, but the idea of, serious, heavy work. And I was offered once a fellowship, but I wasn't able to come. But I'll come back one day if they invite me. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you. I'm standing because this room is very large, and I want to make sure people at the back see me. So I'm going to talk to you first about this book that came out a year ago, which was frankly the result of me being somewhat depressed during the pandemic and during the Trump presidency. I'm sure I was not the first. And then I'm going to talk to you about the project, the data collection that I'm now engaged in. I cannot talk to you about the result of the new project, since we're still very much into the data collection phase, but I'll tell you about what some of the findings that are emerging, and they're particularly important now after the outcome of the US election, because we've been interviewing non-college educated workers, blue collar and low status white collar workers in Manchester, New Hampshire, about their relationship to politics. So I'm just mentioning this to keep you excited until the the end of the talk, when I'm going to talk about the new project. So the idea of seeing others is the following. During the first Trump presidency, now I'm very sorry to have to call it the first Trump presidency, I like many people, I was somewhat depressed, so I decided to read the literature on how people find hope. And when you read this literature, you realize that a lot of it is about how people project themselves into the future. So what narratives are people exposed to that give them tools to imagine alternative futures? And this is partly important after 40 years of growing inequality, because what we've seen in the US is a growing mental health crisis, especially among millennials and Gen Zs. I don't like these categories, but I'm using them for pragmatic reason, as people came to realize that the American dream was not working for them. So what are the new collective myths that are emerging that allow people to find hope in moments of difficulty? And the book is titled Seeing Others, because what I found from this project that I'm going to talk to you about is that as the American dream is declining, a lot of people are embracing an alternative vision of reality, which is that they want to lead their best life today, which means in part living authentically, having others understand them the way that they truly are. And that also comes hand in hand with narratives of inclusion that are omnipresent in the public sphere. And now that I'm saying this, you're thinking, duh, of course. But at the same time, as a cultural sociologist, studying exactly how this happens and how these new narratives emerge and become institutionalized is, of course, a sociological process. It has to do with the kind of cultural processes that I've always been interested in studying. And I'm partly interested in studying how group boundaries can be made more flexible. And basically the relationship, for those of you who have not been exposed to my work before, a lot of my work has been about symbolic boundaries, how people make distinctions based on various criteria, which can be, for instance, moral criteria. Think about boundaries toward low-income people in terms of deservingness, or based on cultural sophistication. So this, of course, comes out of the work of Bourdieu, familiarity with high culture, cosmopolitanism, or boundaries based on money and success. Think about Trump, okay? So how these criteria come together and are used to draw social boundaries, which have to do with access to resources, which manifest themselves in who marries whom and where you live, which then shapes spatial boundaries. So this might all seem pretty obvious to you now, but it's essentially about the role of culture in shaping inequality. And over the last 40 years in sociology, there's been a lot of research trying to understand how these things are articulated better, so that we move from thinking about inequality as being essentially based on the distribution of resources to thinking of inequality as produced by cultural processes. And that's where my work is located in the field of sociology. I'm giving this 1-minute intro for the economists in the room, if there are any, or the historians, or people who don't think in terms of cultural processes. And here you have 2 copies of the book. The white one is the American one. And I think the graphics here illustrate very well what the book is about, which is essentially about how to broaden the circle of those who feel that they belong, the group of people who feel they have cultural citizenship. And you have different circles of different colors that represent groups that are more or less inside or outside this definition, and groups that are of different colors, that's not random, and of different size. And one of the basic theoretical issues behind is that groups experience very different groups of levels of groupness, and you will see later on why this matters. The yellow one is the version that came out in the UK with Penguin, and the 2, as you can see, the Brits and the Americans couldn't agree on the title. They don't have the same title. The Brits title, I think, is the best title. It's really the title that tells you what the book is about, but I really deeply dislike this design because to me, it sounds like nudging, like all the literature that comes out on nudging, which, they all look like puzzles like this. Okay, so the context, as I said, is one of wanting to learn how people think differently about the future. And the idea for the book emerges at the time when we've seen an explosion of social movements that have to do with recognition claims. Different groups feeling that they are invisible underestimated, treated unfairly, discriminated against, etc. And they take the street or different other approaches, they mobilize to make recognition claims. And this is happening on the left of the political spectrum, with, of course, Black Lives Matter or Me Too, but also on the right or the extreme right, with, for instance, the MAGA movement, which has often been described as a movement appealing to working class people who feel or downwardly mobile and who embrace nationalism as a way to lift up their status, right? So if we want to understand how, therefore it means it's even more important to understand how recognition works. And the goal, this is the first book that I wrote for a larger audience. All my other books were really written for academics, but this is, I decided to take on the challenge of writing such a book because I have colleagues such as Steve Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, who had produced this book, How Democracy Dies, which during the Trump years was very helpful to explain to the large audience what were the challenges to democracy and what had happened before and how people, so I felt sociologists need to do the same thing. And of course, some people were doing it, Arlie Hochschild, Stranger in Their Own Land, but I felt here there's a general process that's happening, threats to recognition. As soon as Trump became president, he passed the travel ban for Muslim countries. And I felt like, oh, and then there was attacks on trans rights and bang, 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 I could see it happening repeatedly. And I thought, okay, this is a basic fundamental cultural phenomenon. And people don't have the tools to understand that this, in fact, is something that we can really generalize about. And we need to understand how this takes place. And it would be great if people could basically think about this in a more systematic way instead of just, engaging in Muslim hatred and then queer hatred and then, woman bashing. So that was the goal. So, so the question, as I said, is how do we define who belongs, who matters? And that means studying the scripts, the institutionalized, widely shared scripts that become part of the cultural structures that we live in, the shared taken of granted notion of what can be said publicly. And in order to study this, I decided to focus on people whose profession involves producing such scripts. So professional change agents, I came to call them, who engage in the production of narratives about who's in and who's out. So that part of the study is really about the top to bottom production of shared scripts about who matters. But I also wanted to look at the other side of the coin, which is what ordinary people say and how they draw on cultural scripts that are available to them. So this is very central to cultural sociology, which one of the ways we distinguish ourselves from anthropology or in other fields, or cultural studies for that matter, is to look in very systematic empirical details about the relationship between the cultural repertoires that are available in our environment and how people draw on these repertoires to make sense of their lives. The connection between the micro, meso, macro is absolutely crucial there. So the ordinary people that I decided to study are what came to be known as Gen Z. So like many people, I'm very critical of these categories that are produced by marketing people. But on the other hand, people in that age group, which were basically born between, 2017 and, later 2012, it varies how it's defined. But this category self-describes as Gen Z. So it became institutionalized as a widely shared name that the group has appropriated. So it exists at the intersubjective level, even if demographers contest the reality of the group. So I focus on the progressive and liberal end of the political spectrum. I don't look at the production of narratives on the conservative end. There are other books that do this, simply because I couldn't do everything when I was doing this book. And then I illustrate the argument with these two T-shirts, because you'll see why. So there might be some Gen Zs in the room, I'm not sure. Max Weber postdocs are too old to be Gen Zs, but so the person with the white t-shirt is Zachary Drucker. It's a trans person who played a very important role in the creation of a TV show called Transparent, which tells the story of a middle-aged woman who becomes, you know, a man who becomes a woman late in life. And this person has to negotiate her new identity with her adult children. And when I interviewed Joy Solway, who created that show, about why that show, they told me, I created that show to humanize trans people, to make them understandable, as you follow the life of this woman as she negotiates her new identity with her grown-up children. And it humanizes her and it makes her, this is what the words that Joy Solway used, less abhorrent. So ding, ding, this is about destigmatization. This is a person who doesn't use the word destigmatization, but in fact, that's the outcome of her daily work. So, and the t-shirt, I see you always and always, is very much about recognition, right? The other t-shirt became a poster that you could find on lawns and on windows during the pandemic. And it's really about ordinary universalism, right? No human is illegal. Love is love. It's a slogan that was at the center of the same-sex marriage movement. It's about celebrating what all humans have in common. And these things are relevant here because what I'll argue in the talk is that if we want to understand how to foster a broadening of cultural membership, there are several strategies that can be used. One of them is the celebration of what I'll call ordinary universalism, which is what all human beings have in common, and we will see how this is happening now. So this is where the talk is very much a talk which is about hope. And this is important because I think so much of the social sciences and sociology in particular is about constraints, what limits people's ability to do things. But we know when it comes to cultural processes that it's about constraints as much as it is about enabling, right? Agency. And we need to look at both of them in relationship to each other. So the study here, you have summary of the data. So we have 185 interviews conducted during the pandemic with agents of change from a number of organizational fields that all contribute to the production of these narratives, but at the macro level. They all have, everyone we interviewed have an audience, a seizable audience, and they also have means to scale up the message so that they get to be diffused very broadly. And you will be very impressed by the people we interviewed because it was the pandemic and everyone was available to talk to us. So the graduate students were really lining up to work on this project because we interviewed a lot of famous people. And then we have 80 interviews with college students from the Northeast and the Midwest. And they were interviewed just before the pandemic and then during the summer of 2020, the summer of Black Lives Matter. And we're really trying to understand what are the narratives that they produce, how do they think and understand what they're trying to do, how they're motivated to do what they do with the content, but also how these narratives diffuse. So it's a story of cultural production and diffusion. And we also talk to the Gen Zs about the reception part of it. So a few concepts. So the literature on recognition comes to us largely from philosophy. Hegel wrote a lot about recognition. You will recognize the name of Axel Honneth and Nancy Fraser or Judith Butler. It's a literature that is very much about broadening, recognition, broadening acceptance. So here you have a definition of Axel Honneth, a social act by which the positive social worth of individuals and groups is affirmed. The approach that I take is more focused on cultural processes, which involves intersubjectivity. So you cannot simply decide, I give myself recognition. This is something that is produced in interaction, and it's an intersubjective process. So here I draw on the literature on social identity. So think, for instance, of the work of Richard Jenkins, who talks about social identity as resulting from self-identification. Who do I think I am? And group categorization. What do other group thinks I am? And social identity is the product of both. So now an anecdote. I'm French Canadian. Haha, some of you didn't know that. It's very important because now you just understood that I'm very different than the person you thought I was, right? I don't think you mentioned the fact that I'm French Canadian in the introduction. There's a lot of stereotype in North America about French Canadian. Historically, we were a population, it's a colonized society. So people were not highly educated and they were like the low skilled workers that English Canadians would use for all kinds of things. And I was born in 57, just before what came to be known as the Quiet Revolution. And I myself experienced, as I was growing up, a very important movement of destigmatization of French Canadian. So it was a movement of self-affirmation that went hand in hand with an explosion in cultural production across all the arts and, entertainment. So in some ways, not to exaggerate the comparison, but it was a little bit like the Black is Beautiful movement. And we came to understand ourselves very differently, and English Canadians came to see us very differently. And so it was really a major social experiment. So that's the kind of change that I have in mind. And this has become, it's very, very important, I think, in the literature on social science. It has, many people have written about things that pertain to this. But I think it's even more important today because in the literature, in the social sciences, a lot of people talk about tribalism, and people talk about the idea that we're naturally, the human nature is such that by definition, we value who we are, and we put down people who are unlike us. Jonathan Haidt's work, for instance, has been widely publicized. So the book can also be read and is very explicitly an attack against this perspective. The premise is really that collective definition of the identity of group is changeable, change all the time, can change more. So that's why it's very much a book about hope, because we will see, I'll give you examples of groups that have been historically stigmatized, people with HIV/AIDS, who are not anymore. So tribalism, forget it. But it's a very hard thing to do since there's a big industry. It's a bit like the nudging industry, right? There's an enormous amount of literature that feeds this. And I think the battle has been lost, at least for now. But anyway, it's worth fighting. So the other side of the coin is the concept of stigmatization that I'm sure you're all familiar with, associated with Goffman. So the two of them together will lead us to understand how cultural membership works. Who is in, who is out, how do we understand our obligations toward people who are like us and different from us? So that's where the moral boundaries kick in. So here I'm drawing, this project was very much influenced by a big research program that I co-led for 19 years together with the political scientist Peter Hall. And this project was called Successful Societies. And it included people from various disciplines, Will Kimlicka, political philosopher, Bill Sewell, the historian, and Swidler, cultural sociologist. It was really a truly multidisciplinary project. And we were charged by Canadian Foundation, the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, to study together successful societies. It's a term we were given, and we were all a little bit appalled because we felt, what's that, a successful society? But then we realized we all have normative commitment in our research, and we decided to take on the challenge. And the project was in some ways influenced by Amartya Sen's work, capabilities, but defined not in an individual way, but in a collective way. So how can we move toward having societies where you have lower intergroup conflict, less suicide? Think about all the indicators of quality of life that we have. What distinguished our approach was really to think about the meso level in terms of both institutions and cultural repertoires. So how can we go about fostering the kind of structures that will enable people and groups to become all they can be. So very much an alternative to the concept of individual grit, which is about the individual pulling themselves by their bootstrap, but really how can we think about creating scaffolding in our societies that allow groups to face the challenges that come their way, to enable agency and to fight, against constraints. So an example would be the adoption of same-sex marriage laws, which were not created for the purpose of generating destigmatization. The argument was very much that LGBTQ people should have the same rights to, visit their partner in the hospital or to inherit wealth. But it had as an intended consequence to send messages to the LGBT community that they're worthy. And immediately as these laws were passed, you had a correlation, decline in attempted suicide among LGBTQI youth. So that's an example of institution operating as a scaffolding to promote well-being. So here are 2-3 slides just on the meta theory that is behind. The talk is not about meta theory. I could have given you this talk, but it would have been probably a little boring to people in the room who are not sociologists. But, we have a fairly large literature in sociology on inequality that is trying to connect the micro level. So for instance, cognition to the macro level patterns of inequality. So here you have, for instance, Doug Massey, categorically unequal. Late in life, Massey became very interested in social psychology, in part because he married Susan Fiske, a very prominent psychologist, and he tried to connect the demographic patterns that he had studied his whole life to cognition, basically, doing stuff that is extremely intracranial, that is, the association of women with warmth and men with competence, not the kind of things sociologists normally do. And then you had the beginning of other literatures trying to move toward connecting cultural scripts, cultural repertoires to macro patterns of inequality. But I feel we still have a lot of work to do in connecting the macro, meso, and macro level, which is what I've been trying to do the last few years. And what does it mean at the theoretical level is if you think about the production of inequality as a multi-dimensional process, that or a multidimensional outcome that results from various types of processes. The type 1 processes are the ones that have been studied in classical theory, introduction to sociology of inequality. That's what you learn: exploitation, domination, opportunity hoarding. Think about, Charles Tilly, durable inequality, of course, Marx and Weber, very classical stuff. Since the 80s, you've had the explosion of the literature on culture and inequality. So think about Bourdieu, symbolic capital, cultural capital, et cetera, which is really much more about signaling in everyday interaction and how they influence the distribution of material resources and the reproduction of inequality. The kind of processes that I'm interested in is the type 3. So you think about how these are cultural processes: identification, stigmatization, racialization, recognition. There's more, standardization, commensuration, the list is long. And that literature is growing, but it's still in the process of being systematized. So if you think about this at the more macro level, we could multiply these things. Like Piketty is not there, right? Like there's many, many ways of doing this, but the cultural and social process group is really where I think my work is. Ecological effect. Think about William Julius Wilson, for those sociologists among you, or Cecilia Ridgway in the last. Okay, so I wrote and co-authored a number of papers that get at these various processes, but I'm not going to talk to you today. I'm just, flashing this slide to tell you, if you want to know more, you can have a look at these papers. The last one is probably the one that is most synthetic in terms of connecting all this together. Okay, so let's return to the findings of the book. Okay, so I already talked about the importance. So it's very much of a sociological argument, because what I'm interested in is how to broaden cultural citizenship by not just telling people be nice and be empathic and love each other, but understanding how can cultural structures be promoting a wider range of criteria for evaluating people morally or otherwise. So that's one approach that I'm going to be discussing. And I'll tell you in a few minutes the 3 approaches that I'm going to use. But first, let's discuss briefly the context, which you're all familiar with. Decades of growing inequalities since the early 1980s with the neoliberal turn, and which now is coming hand in hand with the rise of the radical right. We have a major mental health crisis in the US, and I gather in many European countries. And the neoliberal scripts of self have become fully institutionalized. We talk increasingly about the college degree operating as the college divide, operating increasingly as a caste system in the American context, with people in this room, those of us in the population who have a college degree and are professional and managers having access to everything, and those who don't have that falling further and further down with the death by despair and everything that comes with it. So the part of these changes that I'm really most concerned with are these neoliberal scripts of self, and how they have become so strongly institutionalized that they are creating a society that is characterized as a caste system, if you will. There's a growing literature on the college divide along these lines, and which goes hand in hand with the growing influence of meritocracy, which appears, this paper by Jonathan Meisch shows clearly how belief in meritocracy has grown enormously across all Western societies since 1930. And it increased in all but 5 of the 23 countries that he looked at, with the US and the UK being those where 95% of the population embraces meritocracy. But we all know that people like meritocracy because they think efforts are being rewarded. People who work hard and are determined and are smart end up higher, and that's great. At the same time, we all know that we're not operating on an even playing field. My children have 2 parents with PhDs, so they are born on an escalator. We all know this, but the population as a whole is conscious of that. People are now talking about Nepo babies, but nevertheless, the commitment to meritocracy remains very high. At the same time, as many people are now questioning whether getting a college degree is worth it. And it's, institutionalized in part through things like the recent electoral success of Trump, since he, in some ways, of course, he had so many advantages, but at the same time, he presents himself as the incarnation of this bundle of virtues that represents the neoliberal script, that is competitiveness, capacity to be successful in socioeconomic terms, and self-reliance, and which are associated with meritocracy. So in a context of this hegemony of meritocracy, you have a growing divide between the upper middle class that is celebrated and the deep stigmatization of the working class and low-income people, which is feeding this hopelessness among people who are in the lower half of the social structure. So then we ask ourselves, at the same time, you have this crisis of the American dream, which seems increasingly more out of reach for a growing number of people. At the same time, as in the American context, the American dream is the symbol of cultural citizenship. Many immigrants embrace it with great, enthusiasm, because it's the reason that has motivated their immigration to the US. At the very same time that upward mobility is more out of reach. So those are the things that are really creating this crisis that is now feeding the mental health crisis. Okay, so this is the situation. So how do we move forward? So the book describes 3 different approaches. There are many, many ways of dealing with this crisis, but the one approach that I'm talking about in the book is really the transformation of these cultural narratives. So the question is, who produces them? How do they produce them? And what do those narratives, these new narratives, look like? And I'm focusing on 3 approaches. One is to move from a unidimensional system for evaluating worth that is represented by these neoliberal scripts of self toward a more multidimensional approach, which would include, for instance, putting more emphasis on care as compared to socioeconomic success. A second approach is the celebration of ordinary universalism, celebrating what everyone has in common as opposed to celebrating only those who are successful. And the third aspect is stigma reduction. So the empirical study it's an empirical study of the public sphere. So we move from the Habermasian approach to the public sphere, which is, you know what Habermas is about. I don't need to summarize it to you. So we turn to some of the more recent papers that tell us, okay, the public sphere today doesn't look at all the way it looked under Habermas. So we have, social media, we have the professionalization of social movements, etc. So we can represent the public sphere through the organizational fields where these new narratives are produced. So there's a number of fields that are involved. They are of different size, which is not reflected on this. So what we did is we took this as a point of departure to sample people, possible respondents in a very wide range of organizational fields. And as I said, it was the pandemic, so people were very eager to talk to us. So we came up, I have only one slide, but if you read the book, which I hope you can go to the appendix and you will see the people we reached out to, and we were very, very lucky. So the person, for instance, one of my favorite people on this list is Channing Donghae, because when we interviewed her, she was in charge of the global programming for Netflix. And she's the person who decided to show, I know I'm blocking on the name. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Basically shows in India and Africa that provided Black Panther, that provided a very positive vision of the history of Black people. So it made a real difference that this movie could be diffused at the global level. Or, The Handmaid's Tale, which is still referred to in the context of the end of Roe versus Wade in the US. So these shows all include cultural representation of what our lives should be that challenge a lot of shared, more less inclusive vision of where we are and what we should be. So an example of the kind of narratives that these people are produced was given to us by an artist named Hank Willis Thomas, who produced this video. If you go on YouTube and you type question bridge, you will see this video for which 150 Black men who live in various, parts of the US were asked a single question: what does it mean for you to be a Black man today? And what the takeaway is that they have basically nothing in common, except for the fact that they experience microaggression all the time in their daily life. And what this artist did is that he collaborated with an organization called the Campaign for Black Men Achievement, which was behind the Brothers Keeper campaign that Obama used during his presidency. And it's a very important organization that operates a little bit like a spider web over American society. And they diffused this video across a lot of high schools and community centers to have conversation around the stigmatization of Black men. And it was literally a campaign for destigmatizing Black men. And when I interviewed the president of this organization, he said that their goal is to really transform the perception of Black men as a source of social problem, the deadbeat dad stereotype that is associated with them, to make them viewed as a source of potential and social transformation. So this is part of a much, much, much broader and very, very significant movement in the US, which has involved connections between cultural producers, such as Hank Willis Thomas, and many philanthropic organizations. So the Ford Foundation, which is one of the largest foundations in the US, had a huge impact in doing this, in that the president, who is retiring now, Darren Walker, when he became president of Ford Foundation 10 years ago, he said, my primary goal is to fight inequality, and I'm going to do this by using 4 pillars. And one of the 4 pillars will be narratives, capturing hearts and minds. So to make very conspicuously and explicitly an attempt to transform narrative became a center of focus for one of the largest foundations in the world. And that's not only him. Gates did the same thing. He launched a big program to destigmatize low-income people, to raise awareness that inequality was due to structural factors as well as other factors. So I'll give you an example of what the Ford Foundation did. The film Roma is a film that was produced through an organization sponsored by Ford. In this film, some of you may have seen it. It won an Oscar. It tells the story of 2 indigenous women in Mexico City who are domestic workers for this middle-class family. And the film, you just follow these 2 women, and the middle-class family is always blurred in the background, which is very novel because normally it's the maids that are blurred in the background. And one of them is in the process of deciding whether to have an abortion. So this film was very much, it was conducted in collaboration with the National Alliance for Domestic Workers. And I interviewed Agent Poo, who's a very important leader in this movement. And they said explicitly, our goal was to destigmatize domestic workers, to humanize them, to make them seen in multi-dimensional ways. So here I'm repeating myself. That's what is happening, you know, the idea. And then we interviewed 75 stand-up comics. We have a paper that shows how do they think about how their work feeds into destigmatization. And we created a typology of how their work contributes. They say their work contributes to recognition. So they say typically our job is to make people laugh. It's not to force people to eat their vegetables. But as we are making people laugh, we spend a lot of messages. So one of them is a strategy we call the Trojan horse strategy, which is, you know, as I make people laugh, I also make fun of the racist or the homophobic. So it's very much part of what they do. So the book proposes this notion of recognition chain, which connects basically the work that the cultural producers are doing with the resources of the foundations to scale up the message. So you have this enormous movement of transformation of the public sphere. When I decided to write the book, and we presented the book out prospectus to publishers, it seemed very novel. By the time the book came out in 23, there had been Black Lives Matter. Like everyone thought, yeah, duh, we know this is happening. It became so extremely blatant after the Black Lives Matter movement that it's now totally taken for granted. And now, of course, you have a huge backlash. But part of this has been also to offer alternative models to the neoliberal scripts of self. And we see that, for instance, among employers who are offering work-family programs that you know, allow employers to spend more time taking care of their children, or, you know, going to the doctor with their elderly parents. And we know that these programs are increasing a lot the level of loyalty that employees have toward their employer, because they feel like they're seen as caregivers, not only as producers of services. So that's one approach that seems to work, and that the book promotes as an approach to social change. I think I'm talking a little too long, right? Do I have another 20 minutes or so, or what do you say? 15. 15? Okay. I can go shorter if you want. 10, 15. Yeah? Okay, I'll go very fast on the other 2 approach. Another one, we can think about the groups that have been stigmatized historically who are not as stigmatized. Is the case for people with HIV/AIDS. When I arrived in the US in '83, it was just the beginning of the AIDS crisis. Everyone was really scared of people who had AIDS. And over the last 20 years, or 40 years rather, this really turned around. They're not stigmatized anymore, and it did not happen randomly. So we used, whereas people who are obese were very obese 40 years ago, and they're still very obese. So why did it happen in one group and not the other? So we wrote a paper that tries to tackle this challenge by using books such as Abigail Segui, What's Wrong with Fat, which traces why is it that obese people did not become destigmatized, and why is it that book by Steve Epstein on HIV/AIDS, why did the campaign to destigmatize HIV/AIDS work? And the answer basically is that it is a cultural process. The key agents are, key social actors are knowledge workers, legal expert, medical experts, social scientists, journalists that provided alternative narratives about who can get AIDS and whether these people are morally guilty. So we went from thinking, oh, AIDS is a disease that hits gay people who are promiscuous, spend too much time in public restroom having sex with random people, to anyone can get AIDS. It's not. So the destigmatization of the disease was absolutely crucial. And then you also had people like Lady Di, who came to the US and removed their gloves and was photographed shaking hands with people who had AIDS. And you had Magic Johnson, big African-American athlete, who stood up and said, I have AIDS. So it was really a process of cultural diffusion of the transformation of script, but that was not done individually. It was done by drawing on cultural resources that were part of the environment. So the point, whereas all of this did not happen for people with obesity, the medical profession stood by the notion that healthy at any weight was not true, that a high BMI was bad, although the notion of BMI is now very much contested. So social change did not happen the same way. So the point of this part of the book is really to say, representation of stigmatized groups, it's a cultural achievement. It can change. It has changed in the past. It will change again. And there's tons of book in the social sciences, how the Irish became white. This is something that most social scientists know, but. Okay, so that's the second mechanism that the book talks about. And the third one is really the celebration of ordinary universalism, which was so important for Gen Zs in the interviews that we conducted with them. And the next slide got screwed up for some reason, but here you go. It's a paper that demonstrates that what the Gen Zs do is that to some extent, they embrace the American dream. They are young Americans. They are agentic. They think hard work is important, but they really combine this with a focus on the therapeutic ethos, the notion that, you need to have a work-life balance, that we have mental health, that we have to take care of ourselves, that we shouldn't work too much. So a very, very important set of ideas that really temper, and they all embrace ordinary universalism, which manifests itself in the notion that, we need to live our best life now because we don't know if in 30 years we'll be alive given global warming. They're extremely pissed at boomers about this. And they cannot understand organizing a life over, upward mobility over 20, 30 years since they don't know what's coming. So this, of course, approach has been very much denounced as wokeism. But I think a lot of the strong feelings that people have around this is tied to the fact that the American dream seems like a dead end to them. It's not something that is realistic. It's not something to be pursued. Therefore, you have to create your best life today. So this is, this celebration of ordinary universalism, you find it at many levels. And I can return to this in the Q&A if you want to really elaborate on this. So this diffusion of cultural repertoire that is happening at so many levels, and I've given you just a few examples, results in, connecting the micro, meso, and level. At the meso level, these creation, these thousands points of light. And that's where the book is very much about the collective production of hope. You have these narratives that are spread out through our society, and, together there is counter movements for sure, but together they make these ideas much more readily available. And at the ground level, You have the proliferation again during the pandemic. This poster was found everywhere in the US, as a celebration against, against the anti-Muslim movement. So this is at the micro level of ordinary citizens. So that's the kind of cultural process that the book focuses on, if you will. So now, the next project, I'll talk to you about it very quickly, is to understand how different groups are using different paths for finding recognition. So I've decided to revisit the working class in the early 1990s. I did research on working men in Paris, in New York. I did in-depth interviews with white and Black men living in and around New York, and white and North African men living in and around Paris. And in these interviews, I was trying to understand how these people were drawing basically moral boundaries, and how these moral boundaries translated into strong boundaries toward low-income people and Blacks in the US, and basically anti-immigrant boundaries in France. So there I decided, 40 years later, basically, to go back in the context of the growing popularity of the far right, to understand whether and how much do non-college educated, low-status white-collar workers and blue-collar workers seek recognition through politics. So in political science, there's a large literature on low information voters. For a lot of people, French political science, there's huge literature on why working class people don't vote. So we decided to go to Manchester, New Hampshire, which is basically where the Industrial Revolution started in the US, and to talk with young people, 18 to 30, about how they think about politics as a place where to seek recognition. And this was, me, it sounded like a good idea, because the MAGA movement had already decided to go after these workers, and they were courted very assiduously during the presidential campaign. But at the same time, these young people had been exposed to the Black Lives Matter movement. A lot of them, we presume, had also embraced this language of inclusivity that is at the center of the book Seeing Others. And at the same time, we know that many workers don't vote because they feel like, the political elite doesn't care about them, or because they feel they don't have enough information. So we face like this working class that on the one hand is courted by the extreme right or the far right. There's been a generational change where many of them may embrace inclusion, and at the same time, many of them feel very alienated from politics. And I decided to collaborate with colleagues at the University of Manchester in the UK, also birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, to explore how they think about these same question. So here you have Manchester, New Hampshire. For those of you who don't know where it is, it's basically an hour north of Boston. And physically, there's a lot of similarity with Manchester, UK. You have these huge red brick buildings. And the question we asked is also about the connection between place identity and class identity. So right now, with my graduate students, we're finishing 40 interviews. And what we find is that indeed a lot of them are embracing inclusion. In our sample, you have a number of young people who are queer, who really want to have a life that's organized around inclusion. You have a number of them also embracing Trumpism, and a lot of them don't want to vote because they say that no one cares about them. So this language of alienation that has very much been used to explain the Trump victory is very present in our interviews, because they say, it's impossible to buy eggs. The Economist Nobel laureate tell us the economy is doing great, but we have 2-3 jobs to just be able to not be homeless. So this working class is very much down on its knees and feels very much not heard and not seen. And personally, I was not surprised to see the outcome of the election, because this line of argument was very, very central to our interviews. And we know how many workers who were not expected to vote showed up at the polls. So with the outcome that we know. And also we know from our interviews that there's total disconnection between class identity and place identity. They don't know anything about the history of the working class, the fact that Manchester, New Hampshire was a place where there were major strikes and where there was a very, very strong working class consciousness. So we have hypotheses about differences between them and the British workers, that where in the UK we will have much stronger connection between class and place identity than it is the case in the US. But the colleagues in the UK have not started doing these interviews, so it's too early to talk about similarities and differences. And the second paired comparison that will be at the center of this book is about Indigenous people and how they use recognition through work and environmental justice to gain recognition. So here I gave myself the beautiful present of going back to where I grew up. So when I was growing up, just next to Ottawa, but on the Quebec side. On the one side of the river, 80% of the population speaks English. On the other side, 80% of the population speak French. So you have very strong, you know, symbolic and social boundaries and spatial boundaries mixing up together. But 2 hours north, when I was growing up, no one talked about Indigenous people at all. The main divide across Canadian society was the linguistic divide. Not anymore at all. Now it's all about the settler society divide. So I've had decided to study this, which is not easy at all because there's been so much data extraction directed at Indigenous people that to develop a collaboration is a lot of work. So this is the area. You can see Ottawa down there and Montreal, and the four red circles are the First Nation communities where we're in the process of gaining access. I've basically now gained access to 2 communities. And why these communities? Well, this is the watershed of the Ottawa River, otherwise known as Kishizibi. It's larger than Europe. You've never heard about it, but it's, you know, good chunk of North America. And along the Ottawa River, there's a nuclear waste disposal site that is being built. That is just 1 kilometer from the Ottawa River, and that river provides the water for this whole area. So of course, having a nuclear waste disposal site there is very worrisome. And of course, it will be built on the unceded territory of the Algonquin people, and they're not being consulted about this. So of course, it's being contested. So, and it's just being built next to a sacred site called the Oiseau Rock, which is extremely important to them. At the same time, you have groups, the group that is Barrier Lake, the second one, I think. Anyway, they are in the middle of an enormous national park, and there's mining and there's logging, and each of the family have something called a family line, where they go hunting every fall. Like we had to delay our hunting process because our interviewing process because everyone was hunting. It's part of their life, you know. So their environment is being challenged at so many levels. And one, the Pequannogan, the one that is further south, is supporting the project. How did they come to support the project? They wanted the jobs, you know, whereas some of the other First Nations are leading the opposition. So the project is how do they seek recognition through work and environmental justice? And those 2 principles are very much in tension with each other. And I have a graduate student who comes from the Northern Mariana Island, which is 1,000 miles south of Japan. And it's just next to Guam. And there you have Indigenous people as well. My student is Chamorros, and this land is a Commonwealth of the US. So the US has the privilege to build anything they want there. The American military is in the process of creating a new airfield. It's just next to Guam. So if the US enters in a conflict with North Korea and China, that's where, you know, the missiles are going to take off. And this is in Tinian. This is where one of the islands is called Tinian, and that's where the bombs for Hiroshima took off. and more than 1,000, planes went to bombard Tokyo, taken out for this. So it's strategically extremely important. So these Chamorros face a similar dilemma to the Algonquins in Canada. So with the same question, they want the jobs, but they also want to protect, the nature, which is so deeply tied to their identity. So the project as a whole, it's not only this juxtaposed case study, it's very much about, how do groups mobilize themselves to make recognition claim. So there's hypotheses that have to do with the kind of groupness and identity that each of these groups experience. And we know, for instance, that the Chamorros have a much weaker group identification than it is the case for the Algonquins. They live in an environment where there's not everyday discussion about settler colonialism, which is now so much more salient in Canada. So we're trying to understand how these four groups that I just talked to you about are really mobilizing to make claims, and how their mobilization or not is tied to the degree of groupness that each group experiences. And here I'm drawing on a model that we developed for the book Getting Respect, which is really about how groups experience themselves in tension to the boundaries they draw toward the dominant group, the cultural repertoires that are available to them, how the model of incorporation that prevails in their environment, and a lot of other factors. So since I don't have much time left, I'm just going to skip some of this. I'm just basically signaling to you. And the book, which is tentatively titled Recognition Globally, will also have a section on what I define as the impossible path. So think about, making claims based on sexuality in Senegal or, Uganda, or on religion in China, race in France, or, elsewhere. So we know that since 45, there's been just an explosion in human rights and multiplication of groups that used to be excluded that are now incorporated. And yet you have societies that are very much closing crucial paths that we take for granted in the Western context as paths for recognition. So to understand, to provide a kind of, broad perspective on this is what I think this book is about, but it's still very much in progress, and I'm still trying to decide how much it's going to be a book for a general public versus a social science book. Maybe it will be both at once, I'm not sure. So I'm going to stop here and thank the collaborators who are involved in this project with me, as well as the funders that are making this possible. It's too early to tell you what we're finding, but it gives you a little bit of an idea of where I'm going. So I'm going to stop here so we have a little time for questions if we do. Thank you.